just ensure that my mic is turned on here. I have an extra layer on today. It's the most pink vestment that I could find in our closet. Am I on now, Paul? Am I on? Check one, check two. Oh, appears I am. Thank you, Paul. And the children are already gone, right? All right. Step ahead of me. It's good. I sense joy in the room today. The joy of the Lord is our strength, indeed. Well, if you've been churched for many years, especially if you've spent years in an evangelical church or two, you've probably heard what I'm about to say a few times around this time of year. In fact, you might have said it yourself in the past. You might have said it to yourself in the past few days if you're tracking with our lectionary readings. What am I referring to? Well, the almost inevitable sinking feeling you get when you hit the chapters in the Bible containing the law. Up until now, Exodus 20, the readings in Genesis and Exodus have featured mostly stories, with some genealogies sprinkled here and there, almost as if to prepare us for these daunting chapters of law and instructions that are coming up, and at which we have now arrived. Last Friday, I believe it was, the daily lectionary reading had us in Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments, or the 10 words, as the Jews refer to them. And between the Decalogue that we recited together and the passage that Tim read for us, we covered almost the entirety of Exodus 20. So far, so good. Those are familiar words. Then Saturdays and today's readings brought us into the heart of what is called the Book of the Covenant. This is one of the first quit points, as I mentioned earlier, that bogs down those who are trying to follow a Bible reading plan, or should I say, threatens to bog down someone trying to follow a reading plan. Or another technique people use is to just let their eyes skim over the text and drops their brain into first gear and picks up when it gets interesting again. The problem with that approach is that the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 21 through 23 is only the beginning of Old Testament chapters containing laws and instructions. For we have the rest of Exodus in front of us, then we have Leviticus, then we have Numbers, and then we have Deuteronomy. For 10 points, does anybody know what the word Deuteronomy means in Greek? The second law. Yes. And did you know that between 65 and 70 chapters of the Old Testament contain law and instructions? That's 7.5% of the total 929 chapters in the Old Testament. So that might not sound like much. People like Letty and Daphne might be doing calculations in their brain. It's not a lot, but the Old Testament is the story of the Old Covenant people of God, the nation of Israel, the forefathers of our faith. So to ignore the laws and instructions is to essentially ignore the history of the people governed by these laws. It's to ignore the history of our own faith. Imagine you were to arrive in Canada by plane, not knowing anything about Canada. You go to the newsstand and you pick up all of today's newspapers and you read them. And then you walk around for a few hours in Canada observing people, and maybe you talk to some of them. At the end of the day, would you then conclude that you understand Canada? I hope not. In the same way, it's crucial to know that we need some accurate and informed understanding of the laws and instructions given to ancient Israel. And if that sounds like a big project, you're correct. It is. But we have time. We have time. We'll be in Leviticus and Numbers in April and in Deuteronomy through May. Plus, Deuteronomy is a retelling of the story of the departure from Egypt and a giving of the laws. So we'll be circling back around in May to see some of the laws through different lenses and to go deeper when the text warrants. So today is really an introduction and orientation to Old Testament laws. And you'll be happy to know that today I'm taking an approach that less is more. After a few years of running library orientations for incoming Bible college students, I realized the wisdom of a minimal approach to orientation, and I would give these new students one page in 14-point font called The Least You Need to Know About the Library, trusting that when they needed to know more, they would dig deeper. And my hope is that after today, you will feel much more inspired and a bit more equipped to engage with the law passages in the Old Testament. So today I simply want to alert us to the law's purpose, its format, and its relevance. Purpose, format, and relevance. Those are my 3 points, but they sound a bit dry. So I'm going to phrase them as questions that I will answer briefly. Namely, what was the law for? That's number 1. Why does it appear so random? That's number 2. And 3, isn't it just for the Jews? So firstly, what was the law for? That is the purpose question. What was the law for? Think back to your childhood or to your own parenting. Did your household have house rules? Can I see a show of hands if your household had house rules? Wow, we have a lot of anarchists or parents who are anarchists. Of course they did. Of course they did. But why? Why did your houses have rules? What did it matter if anyone did what they wanted, whenever they wanted? Perhaps some of those rules, written or unspoken, are coming to your mind as I speak. Does anybody have one that they want to mention? Bedtimes. What about bedtimes, Nancy? Bedtimes based on your age. And observe them and obey them, I would think. Yes, that is implied, or else. Any other household rules that you remember? Candace? Pick up after your spell. Especially the Lego, right? Lego do a number on parents' feet. Any others that come to mind? Check the hot water before you have a bath. Good one, Alan. That's a first for me. But definitely for me, check the direction of the tap in the kitchen before you put your face under to take a sip, right? Why couldn't the growing teenager just eat the dinner ingredients as a snack? Why did everybody have to wipe their dirty shoes on the mat before coming into the house? Why couldn't the children just shout at the parents whenever they felt like it? So what would be some reasons for having and abiding by house rules? Your turn again. What are some reasons for having and abiding house rules? So things go smoothly in the household. So there's safety. Any others? So in a nutshell, Elaine, yes. Bhakti? It's better for the relationship. Oh, all wonderful answers. Well, in case it wasn't clear from the Old Testament that God is a God of order, St. Paul says so in 1 Corinthians 14, writing that God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. And his commands and instructions exist so that all may be done decently and in order. That word decently points to the innate goodness of order, or at least the innate goodness of godly order. I'm sure we can all think of ways that order gets perverted. I think of totalitarian governments on a national scale who create laws to hamstring the freedoms of the people under their rule. And on a personal level, maybe we know people with personal disorders like OCD and over-scrupulosity. But we have good order, godly order in view here. And where do we learn what good and godly order it is? The Bible, which also gives us a common sense reason for having laws at all. Because when you're establishing government for over 2 million people, you need written laws. That is the very reason why Moses ascended Sinai and gathered all the laws together. Because now Israel was a people, a nation, and not simply a family. I believe it was last Tuesday that you would have read Exodus 18 if you're following along in the lectionary readings, and you would have seen here Moses' father-in-law Jethro, the priest and judge of the faithful Midianites who had continued to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, recommend to Moses in this instance that he should appoint judges because he can't do all the work alone. Which invites the question, how would these judges know how to arbitrate cases and administer justice? We might ask Tim, how did you learn to try cases? Law school. Well, here's what we often gloss over in Jethro's advice. Moses took these elders to law school. Before he recommends appointing judges, Jethro recommends instructing them in the law. See, the judges appointed must first understand the law before they can administer it. Jethro reverses Moses' question, so Moses can see clearly what must be done in order to bring order. This is an Old Testament case of everything being done decently and in good order. So, order is good. Godly order is best. And we discover what godly order is only through Holy Scripture. But it doesn't stop at order. It also requires fear, which we saw in the passage that Tim read. Now, what does that mean, fear? It's not any old fear, just as we saw the requirement of godly order, we see here the requirement of godly fear. And in the Bible, godly fear means reverent respect. Reverent respect. So our pursuit of order must always arise out of respect for God. If it doesn't, our attempts at ordering life will not show respect for God, but will put ourselves in the place of God as idols of self, and that is dangerous. Purpose of the law, on the other hand, was to put self in proper perspective as God's character and God's will was revealed through his law. And yes, even through the most seemingly random of laws, such as do not boil a goat in its mother's milk, which the law repeats 3 times. And this brings me to my second point. Why does the law appear so random? Why does it seem to go all over the place? Why does it seem to go from big, important laws, as we understand them, to minute, specific laws that seem to apply only to ancient Israel? This is the format question. Think back again to your household rules. Did your parents, or did you, as parents, write out every single rule? No? None of you presented every baby you brought home from the hospital with a copy of the house rules? Of course not. Now, some rules go without saying, right? Or if you do say them, you only have to say them once. Some rules parents never expect to have to say. Close the dryer door so the cat doesn't sleep in it. Right? We might chuckle at that instruction, and it's probably never going to get written down. You don't open the dryer door and see that. Make sure the cat isn't inside. But it's actually a matter of life and death. If that dryer gets turned on, that cat might lose its life, and that family might lose its beloved pet. Now, I don't mean to harsh the mood on Laetare Sunday when we're supposed to be a bit lighter, but this example isn't arbitrary or morbid, at least I didn't intend it to be so. Rather, it reflects exactly what we see in the law. So what can seem so random in the law is at every point actually a recipe for flourishing life in the desert and later in the promised land. You see, all these seemingly random commands and instructions are not random, but are rooted in the 10 Commandments, the 10 words. Each one of them can be and should be and need to be correlated back to individual commandments for us to understand why they have been included in the law. I can't unpack this in any great detail today, but notice how the laws concerning slavery in chapter 21 arise out of the first commandment's reference to bringing the Israelites out of the house of bondage to the Egyptians. Bondage and slavery. The laws concerning violence, also in chapter 21, are clearly associated with the 6th commandment, you shall not kill. Laws in chapter 23 concerning speech and bearing witness in legal settings are rooted in the 9th commandment, you shall not bear false witness. And laws concerning time and rest, also in chapter 23, are based on the command to keep the Sabbath. That's the 4th commandment. And on that note, let me just briefly mention here a couple of things. We often see theologians try to make a case that the law about the Sabbath goes away in the New Covenant. But far from being a temporary commandment for the Israelite nation, the 10th commandment in the Sabbath commandments and the 10 commandment is actually a reiteration of the creation law in the earliest chapters of Genesis to keep the Sabbath just as God rested from creating after 7 days. So that's a command for every human being. And I would suggest it's why we have 7 days in the week after all. Now, how we keep it as Christians is another matter. And that brings me to the second thing, and that is that next Sunday we will be welcoming Chad Block, Father Chad, from Emmaus Road in Langley. And he will be instructing us on the Sabbath and also leading our worship as Daniel will be away. And that will line up perfectly with where we are in our lectionary readings as we land on the Sabbath chapter in Exodus 31. So, if God is a God of order and not disorder, then what seems random in the law is never really random. Never. And true to form, we see that what seems random in the chapters recording the law of the covenant are rooted in the Ten Commandments themselves, in general and in specifics. Finally, isn't the Old Testament law just for Jews? Or is it for us Christians as well? This is the relevance question. In full disclosure, I'm not going to fully answer this question today. Partly because we don't have time. I'm intentionally going to leave it hanging. Because, as mentioned, we're going to be in the subsequent biblical books containing the Torah, that is, the teaching of the law, for 2.5 more months. So stay tuned. Plenty of time to come to a solid conclusion to this question of whether the law is for us Christians as well. But I do want to leave you with a couple of considerations based on some comments I've already made. Firstly, if it was necessary for the Jews to obey the law, and it was, it means it's necessary for us Christians to comprehend it in some way. If, as St. Paul wrote in his second letter to Timothy, that all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful or profitable for teaching and correcting and rebuking and training in righteousness, then all the law is useful and profitable in some way. And we know this is what St. Paul had in mind because he was referring primarily to the Old Testament scriptures. The New Testament canon had not yet been collected. So if we are to comprehend, then how do we comprehend as best we can? Well, by putting ourselves to the task of interpreting as best we can. Now, that doesn't mean we all become experts in Old Testament law. But it does mean that we must answer the call to do our best to understand when faced with the text and when asked questions about our faith. As you may have heard in teacher training if you became a teacher, I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. But then you go and find out and ask others for help if need be. Secondly and finally, we've already prayed this morning many times over that the Lord would incline our hearts to keep this law. So our liturgy implies that we should keep at least the 10 Commandments. And if all the laws in the Old Testament are rooted in those 10 Commandments, then we can't brush a single law under the rug. Not one out of the 613 or so. But we can't stop at the 10 Commandments, for even though they first appear in the Mosaic covenant, they themselves are rooted in the overall covenant of grace that God made with humanity simply because he created us. And he wanted to reveal himself to us and welcome us into relationship with him forever. We see a beautiful tableau of the covenant of grace in Exodus 24. When God welcomes Moses and Joshua and the rest of the 70 elders who represent all of Israel into his presence on Mount Sinai. Here, they see the God of Israel with their own two eyes, and they don't die. And under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. They saw God, and they ate and drank. One day we will see the Lord in heaven, just as Moses and the elders did, and we too will eat and drink at the marriage supper of the Lamb that our Eucharistic feast foreshadows. But until that day, let us continually pray that he would incline our hearts to keep his law. Amen. Now would you please stand if you are able as we confess our faith in the words of the Nicene Creed.